VIC-20 had been a market leader for low-cost personal computers, with seemingly nowhere to go but up. Despite the higher price, the introduction of the 64 more or less killed the VIC-20 sales, causing Commodore to quietly discontinue the computer sometime in 1985. This was not really a problem, as the Commodore 64 by itself essentially owned the largest part of the personal computer market in 1984, easily outselling the IBM PC and all of its clones, along with the Apple II, Atari, TRS-80, and everyone else. I didn't put any percentage numbers on this pie graph, as these are really just estimates. Finding hard sales data, especially on some of these other machines, is very difficult, and some of it's contradictory, but I think this chart is roughly correct. Still, I cannot understate the importance of the Commodore 64, as stores like Kmart, Target, and Toys R Us were heavily promoting and selling these computers. Of course, the Commodore 64 was not perfect. It did have some significant disadvantages compared to some of its competitors, particularly because its BASIC was a little bit on the weak side. This was mostly because it lacked any commands for graphics or sound. So people learning BASIC on an Apple II could write simple programs that could produce colorful graphics on the screen, and programming graphics on the Commodore 64 required addressing the video chip's registers directly, which was much more complicated and confusing to newcomers. Another problem with its BASIC was that it lacked almost any disk drive commands. The only 3 commands that it supported directly were load, save, and verify. Anything else, such as formatting a disk, required sending cryptic commands directly to the disk drive, and copying files from one disk to another actually required an entirely separate program. And to make matters worse, the disk drive was the slowest in the entire personal computer industry due to a bug that dated back to the VIC-20. And even though Commodore had changed the color of the 1541 disk drive to match the Commodore 64, it was still the same disk drive inside, and it was interchangeable with the VIC version of the drive. And so the 64 shares the same slow disk drive access problem as the VIC-20. However, this wasn't a huge problem because several third-party products sprang up to solve this problem. For example, to solve the weakness of BASIC, 2 cartridges were available, such as Commodore's own Super Expander cartridge, and then the more popular third-party cartridge called Simon's BASIC. Both did the same thing, which is to add new commands to BASIC, making it much easier to create graphics and sound. As far as the disk drive shortcomings, several third-party products address this, one of the most popular ones being the Epic's Fast Load cartridge. This cartridge not only replaced the crummy disk drive routines in the kernel with faster ones, speeding up load times by as much as 5 times, but it also included shortcuts for many commands. For example, instead of typing out the usual load command like this, you could abbreviate it with a slash. And if you wanted to find out why your disk drive was flashing with an error, you could just type in the @ symbol to get the status of the drive. It also had a menu you could access, which gave options for copying files or disks and making life a whole lot easier. And this was considered a must-have cartridge for Commodore 64 users. Another problem is that schools that used to use the Commodore PET in classrooms were switching to Apple II and other products because the Commodore 64 was not well suited for classrooms. The computer was too small and easily stolen or broken, plus there was a mess of cables everywhere, and to address this, Commodore used a similar case and monitor to the PET and placed a Commodore 64 motherboard inside and rebranded it as the Educator 64. Unfortunately, by this time Commodore had little success gaining back the business of schools, and these machines are pretty rare today. The next year, in 1984, Commodore came out with the portable version called the SX64, which retailed for $999. This system was designed in the familiar luggable form factor that several other computers from the time period used, such as the Osborne, the K-Pro, and compact luggables. It included a tiny 5-inch color screen, although the default startup colors were changed to give a higher contrast on the small screen. The built-in disk drive was compatible with the standard 1541 of the era. It was 100% compatible with all software for the Commodore 64, with certain exceptions. For example, the machine lacked a cassette port, so anything requiring the use of a cassette drive would obviously not work. Of course, by 1985, the entire landscape of personal computing had changed. Just a few years earlier, computers were all about using BASIC to write your own software or games, or typing things in from magazines. And the best games you could get were arcade-style games that came on cartridges just like game consoles. But as the market had changed from a hobbyist computing scene to more of a mainstream computer product, BASIC was almost forgotten. Video games were where the market was, and due to the limitation of cartridge games only being able to hold 16K of information, they also quickly became a relic, replaced almost entirely by games on floppy disk. Disk-based games allowed the 64 to use all of its memory, which allowed far more sophisticated graphics, sound, and game styles. Of course, some markets such as the UK and Australia never really adopted disk drives, and thus most games in those markets were distributed on cassette tape. While the cassette had serious disadvantages over the floppy disk, it did at least have an advantage over cartridges since there was no size limit for programs stored on cassettes either. In 1986, Commodore finally gave the 64 a complete makeover. They called it the Commodore 64C, and it came in a bright beige color with a design to match the Commodore 128 that came out a few months earlier. It also got a new matching monitor and 1541 disk drive called the 1541C. And shortly after that, they replaced it with the 1541-2, which was a smaller drive and finally included dip switches on the back to change the device number. The computer was supposed to be 100% compatible, and essentially the same machine. However, beyond the changed appearance, several other changes were made in the name of cost reduction. Some things were just minor differences, such as the keys. The original keys had the graphics characters printed on the side of the key, where the 64C had everything printed on the top of the key, so that it was cheaper to print them. Inside the computer, there were far fewer chips, as many chips had been combined to reduce cost. Even the RAM chips were reduced. While the original version had 8 chips, the new motherboard had only 2. Of course, both machines still had 64K. They also moved to a different chip manufacturing process. The new version also used lower power chips, which in theory means they should run cooler and therefore more reliable. But one of the biggest changes that people argue about is the SID chip. The SID chip sounds a little bit different between this machine and this machine. Now, which one sounds better depends on who you ask. Also, there's some confusion over the names of these machines. So the white or beige model is, of course, officially called the 64C. But what do you call this model? The only name Commodore ever gave it was the Commodore 64. But in order to help differentiate the two computers when discussing the computers online or via email or whatever, people often refer to this machine as the bread bin or the bread box. Now, why? Well, it kind of looks like a bread bin. At this point, you might think the Commodore 64 had reached the end of its life on the market. However, it continued to sell very well. However, at this point, the competition in the personal computer market had changed and the Commodore 64 was no longer at the top of its class. By this time, the top end of the market was being dominated by 16-bit machines like the Amiga, MS-DOS computers, and the Macintosh. With further price reductions, the Commodore 64 continued to dominate the low end of the computer market, being the most affordable computer with a huge software library. While it started out selling for $595, you can see it here in the Sears catalog selling for $149, which is a cheap computer even by today's standards. The games for the C64 continued to get better and better as software developers learned how to squeeze more out of the system. And while it's awesome that the C64 was even able to play these games, admittedly it was falling behind compared to the 16-bit competition, especially when it came to 3D games like these. Still, it had the advantage of being half the price, or in many cases a quarter of the price of the competition, which still kept the system selling like crazy. Nevertheless, the 64 continued to find new uses. One brilliant move was to bundle GEOS with the new 64C. GEOS stands for Graphic Environment Operating System. It works with the Commodore 1351 mouse and gave the Commodore 64 a general-purpose graphical user interface for the first time. GEOS was bundled with several useful applications such as GeoWrite, which is a word processor offering a what you see is what you get experience for the first time on these machines, much like the Macintosh had been offering for a couple of years already. Also included was GeoDraw, which was an art program. Many additional programs were available for GEOS, such as a spreadsheet and a variety of other software, which helped to breathe new life into the 8-bit machine as it could now do many of the same tasks that 16-bit machines were doing. GEOS would run even better with the addition of a RAM expander. While modems had been available for years, by this time they were starting to catch on a bit with the general public, allowing you to access information beyond your local computer. These modems connected to standard telephone lines, which meant that the telephone could not be used while the computer was using it, unless you had more than one telephone line in your home, which most people did not. And while the internet technically existed, it was rarely used by anyone at this point. However, many other proprietary online services started to become popular, such as Quantum Link. These disks were often given away for free inside of other boxes of software, or sometimes in magazines, or even inside boxes of hardware like modems, for example, in an effort to get more people to subscribe to the service. Quantum Link provided a variety of different services that could be accessed via a modem, everything from chat rooms with other users, gaming, email, downloading new software, home shopping, and reading the news. So, believe it or not, people were doing these things all the way back in the 1980s, even though it didn't become mainstream until the mid-1990s when the internet became popular. Another popular online system for Commodore users was called Habitat. With this service, you could chat with your friends online using little avatars that you could customize to your liking, and then you could roam around this virtual environment, or habitat, and interact with things while chatting with your friends. And there were a variety of places to go and things to do, and you might say this was one of the first online multiplayer games, although the main purpose of it was for socializing. As the machine aged, in the year 1990, Commodore made one last-ditch effort to breathe a little bit of life back into the Commodore 64 platform, and that was by their attempt to release the Commodore 64 GS, which stands for Gaming System. While the concept may seem similar to the Max platform, this version did at least have a full 64K of RAM, making it much more powerful. However, the software library was still very limited because software would have to load from cartridge, which most games abandoned years earlier. And any software that required a keyboard would not work. The machine was ultimately a market failure, and thus it is also very rare to find one today. Throughout its lifetime, there were numerous hardware add-ons and peripherals developed both by Commodore and third parties. These are just some of them. There were a variety of input devices, such as this light pen, the koala pad, a mouse, and paddles. Also things like RAM expanders and 80-column text displays, the Magic Voice speech synthesizer, and here's another speech cartridge. This is an FM music synthesizer cartridge. There were musical keyboards like this, and here's a video digitizer to grab still images from composite video sources. This is a 3.5-inch disk drive that would allow you to use what was at the time more modern disk types. And there were a slew of different modems, both from Commodore and third parties. There were other things like speech recognition devices like this VoiceMaster headset, and the sound sampler that would actually allow you to record sound clips to your computer. And then of course there was the incredible musical keyboard, which was popular probably because it was so simple and cheap, and it was just an overlay for the keyboard. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and in 1994, after 12 years on the market, the Commodore 64 finally stopped production. However, that didn't stop hobbyists from playing with the computers, and they continued to remain popular, especially with demo coders. Demo coders are basically people who find it challenging and competitive to see who can make a computer with limited capabilities do new and interesting things. And while demos have been made on almost every old computer, the Commodore 64 remains one of the most, if not the most, popular architecture to do this on. The computer saw something of a revival in 2004 with the introduction of the Commodore 64 DTV, which stands for Direct to TV. This little joystick contained an actual Commodore 64 condensed down to just a single chip, along with a RAM chip and an EEPROM to store the games. And in 2018, which is basically right now, the C64 Mini was released, which is a similar product, although it runs on an ARM processor running an emulator rather than being true to the original hardware. Interestingly enough, it is almost possible to build a brand new Commodore 64. There is a company currently producing the 64C case from the original molds, and they're identical to the original cases, only made with modern plastics, and you can get them in any color you want. Combined with that, there's a company that's producing a modern motherboard that will fit the case. The only catch is that some chips, like the video chip, must be sourced from original computers, as there's nobody producing those right now. So you can buy and build about 90% of a Commodore 64 from brand new parts. Hopefully someday we'll get that up to 100%. Even to this day, new games are being created and sold for this computer, with more new releases coming out every year than possibly any other vintage computer. For example, in 2017 alone, there were over a dozen really good games released for the Commodore 64, and development continues. Of course, the C64 has made its mark on popular media and been featured in many popular TV shows of the era, such as this episode of Red Dwarf. But more recently, it's been seen in shows such as *Halt and Catch Fire*, where Season 2 practically revolves around the Commodore 64. And let's not forget the movie Pixels, where if you look over to the left, you can actually see both the bread bin and the 64C right next to each other. Okay, and so that about wraps it up for the Commodore 64, but I do have a few more things to tell you. First of all, when I set out to do this Commodore History series, I wanted to tackle these computers chronologically, starting with the PET and ending up with the Amiga. And so I'm definitely still following that line. However, I did want to mention that because the Commodore 64 was in production for so long, that it, chronologically speaking, overlaps the birth and death of many other Commodore machines. So when we move on to the next episode, which is going to cover the Commodore plus 4, we're going to have to jump all the way back to 1983 to talk about this machine. So don't be confused when that episode comes up next. And so that's it for the moment. So stick around for the next episode, and thanks for watching.